At this point in time, there are a number of headlines in our news related to pro-life issues. Just one recently was the headline that assisted suicide is not a health service. That's what's been declared by a German court, also closer to home, of course. There is an Oireachtas hearing into the whole issue of euthanasia. Joining us on the line now to discuss this and other topic as well is Niamh Uí Bhriain from the Life Institute. Niamh, thank you so much for taking time to chat to us today.
Arthur, how are you? Lovely to be here.
Niamh, let's just start with the whole issue of euthanasia. Of course, there was an Oireachtas hearing, which we'll get to in a minute. But first of all, of course, an interesting declaration by a German court. Assisted suicide is not a health service. What's the implication of this?
Well, obviously, a lot of pro-life groups welcomed this ruling, certainly the Life Institute did. And the Federal Administrative Court in Germany, in Leipzig, in Germany, I suppose, issued this clarification. And what it was saying was that ending your own life is not a medical service. It's fundamentally not a medical service. And the use of those words, I think, were really important, because they were saying that the purpose of medicine, according to the court, for example, the use of an anaesthetic to cure or alleviate illness or pathological complaints, that's medical care. But they said medical care does not include suicide, and ending your own life, even if you do so in a hospital, but what's called now assisted suicide, that does not serve a therapeutic function. So they made this very clear distinction between medicine, which is something that heals or alleviates suffering or promotes health, and the demand that we're seeing now in Ireland as well, that the same medical professionals who we rely on, to heal and to alleviate suffering and to promote health, that they would also be involved in suicide, in ending another person's life, and assisted suicide. So I think the distinction made by the court is really important on an international level, because certainly it should point legislators in Ireland to a ruling made by a senior court, which made like this very obvious and critical distinction, if you like, Arthur, which is that medicine is there to help and to heal, and ending a life is the opposite of that.
Interesting indeed. And of course it is. It's very much, one could argue, the argument is very subjective, many could argue, but of course at the end of the day, life is life and death is death. But overall, bring us on to the Oireachtas hearing that's actually happening at the moment in Ireland in relation to euthanasia. What is the focus in terms of what is the stated end goal of this?
Well, there's a joint committee on assisted dying has been set up by the Oireachtas, and there was even some dispute or discussion around the name of that committee, because a lot of people pointed out that this is not about assisted dying; it's about assisted suicide. That it's about the state changing the law so that doctors and nurses can, or perhaps may even be obliged to help somebody end their own life. And that committee is hearing from various experts at the moment, and one of them, and many of the experts, I think, are giving evidence that's really important, and they're clarifying things in a really important way. I think if you were to look, at RTE and the Irish Times, what's happening there is that the coverage of the Joint Committee's hearings are very skewed, and that very often the headline and the main thrust of the article is focused on an expert who will come in, or a campaigner who will come in and argue in favour of assisted suicide. And then, a couple of lines or a paragraph or two at the very end are given to those who are making very persuasive arguments and offering very compelling evidence opposing assisted suicide. So one of the things Life Institute is trying to do is, of course, is to report regularly on this committee so that people can see what those experts who are offering this very strong evidence against assisted suicide are saying. And one of them, for example, in the week, it was Professor Anne Doherty, who is a consultant liaison psychiatrist, and she's the former chair of the Faculty of Liaison Psychiatry and in UCD. And this is obviously somebody who's a consultant psychiatrist who has huge clinical experience in working with people who had incurable or life-limiting conditions. And she said something really compelling. She was talking about that medics like her, that they want to achieve the highest standard for end-of-life care, so that people weren't frightened, that they didn't suffer unnecessarily, that pain was absolutely minimized, that people had dignity and autonomy as they approach death, especially if they're dying, I suppose, of a terminal disease. And there is, we have to acknowledge, Arthur, a huge fear out there. I think people remember back to a time when when palliative care wasn't good, or when palliative care didn't exist at all. And people really fear, I think, that aspect of the end of life, that perhaps if you're dying of an incurable disease or dying of cancer, that perhaps that it's not manageable, that the medics can't manage it. And it's been wonderful to see like the palliative care experts coming out so strongly in this debate saying, look, like palliative care is massively moved on. We can assure you that pain can be minimized, that people can absolutely have dignity and autonomy in death without assisted suicide. And I suppose Professor Doherty kind of was addressing that, but she was addressing the human emotions involved. And she said that a really powerful statement, there would be a travesty if assisted dying became a substitute for assistance in living. And I thought, it was such a powerful statement, because sadly what we're seeing in countries like Canada is that the assisted suicide rates in a few short years are absolutely shooting up. They've gone up by a factor of 5 or 6, which is just an incredible factor. And I think 5% of all deaths now in Canada are by assisted suicide. And we can see from writings around this area, from parliamentary research in this area, in that country, that assisted suicide is increasingly being seen as a way to avoid having to give palliative care. In other words, that palliative care, that the state, or certainly some researchers or some policymakers might feel that it's cheaper to provide assisted suicide than it is to provide good palliative care, or even to provide good medicine. And that's a really, really sad reality we're seeing in countries that have assisted suicide. And I think Professor Doherty's statement there was really strong. She also pointed out that we've run really good programs in Ireland to reduce suicide rates. So I'm not talking here about assisted suicide, but suicide in general. And she's saying that that program was based on this idea that whatever problems or set of circumstances you're up against, that they're not insurmountable. That don't give in to despair, and that with good mental health care, suicide can be avoided. And she's making this very, very important point. And it's been borne out in other countries, and research has shown this, Arthur, that if you cannot tell people on one hand that assisted suicide is a good thing, and the doctor should provide it, and that it's needed and it's valuable, and on the other hand, tell people that suicide is a bad thing. The confusion you create in doing that is something that, according to research from other countries, has led to a more normative acceptance of suicide in general. And that's obviously a really, really dangerous thing. Everybody in this country knows somebody that has been impacted by suicide. Everybody believes that we should try to bring suicide rates down. And there is this huge contradiction there, where we're saying to people, on one hand, we're going to spend millions on campaigns to bring down the suicide rate, and on the other hand, we're going to try to legalize assisted suicide. It just doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's an interesting situation indeed. Bring us to the situation at the Oireachtas at the moment. There was in the news recently, there was an invited guest to this Oireachtas hearing, and there was a bit of controversy about this. Tell us what happened there.
Yeah, so it was interesting, and the William Binchy, who, as everybody would know, is a former professor of law in Trinity College. He's a very highly regarded legal expert, and he was invited by the Oireachtas Committee. So they invite in experts, invite in guests who they feel are campaigners, people who might have something to share with the committee. And William Binchy was invited in to speak to the committee, and he was really treated appallingly by at least one of the members of the committee, namely Independent Senator Lynn Ruane. And somebody posted there, I think Michael Foran, who's a lecturer in law, posted the video of the interaction, and people were just really shocked by it. And I think it ended up getting almost 2 million views. And Lynn Ruane was rightfully very sharply criticised for her behaviour. And really, I think if people haven't seen the video, Professor Binchy is trying to explain why he is opposed to assisted suicide. And he is just being baracked and interrupted in a really angry and hostile way by Lynn Ruane. And to the point where he actually can't speak, and he keeps saying, like, can you let me finish my sentence? Can you? And then she ends up using this old cliche that he's like a white privileged male, and tries to shut him down using that line. And, on Twitter, people were just saying, like, they were calling her out for what they saw as her rudeness, her aggression, her disrespect. People have said her behavior was loutish, like that she was so disrespectful and rude.
I actually have a recording of that interaction between Lynn Ruane and Professor Binchy. We'll just take a quick listen to this here now, just so listeners can get an understanding of what actually happened.
So what is the right of the others?
Well, honestly, I'd like to hear you, or I'd like to speak, but I can't.
No, I have a certain amount of time, and you keep talking in these long sentences instead of asking direct questions,
keep
right?
It short. I'll keep it short.
Keep it short.
Right,
What is the right? Okay. What is the right that you're talking to?
Would you allow me to speak, perhaps without interrupting me? It's a waste of your time, actually, right?
A lot of this has been.
You said there about logic. Could I ask you a question, perhaps?
No, you can't. Sorry, you can't ask me a question. I'm asking you a question.
Okay. Well,
I'm asking you, what rights are you said you're talking in human rights terms, not in religious terms. Tell me what the human rights terms that you're talking about. I'm asking you, what human rights terms?
Well, Andrew mentioned no man is an island. It's an old-fashioned expression, but it means that we're all intertwined humanly.
Social contract, yeah.
Well, if you want to speak, that's
just
fine.
answer the question. Is it right or wrong?
Well,
is it right or wrong to end one's life, no matter what? Is it right or wrong?
It is not right to end one's life.
It is not right, so it's a sin.
No, that is not.
So what is it?
It is not right. If you give me an opportunity to speak without interruption, if that's possible, okay, for the short time you have. It is not right to end one's life. There are limits to what one can do. There are limits to autonomy. This is the point I'm making. There are limits. You have to be concerned for others.
What's the concern for you if I decide to die at the end of my life? How does it impact your life?
Well,
you, as a white privileged man, how does my death impact your life?
Well,
what shocks me about that, of course, is that Professor Binchy is not just a guest of the Oireachtas, but of course, Professor Binchy must be at least 30, if not 40 years her elder. Whatever happened to respecting one's elders?
Stuart Pearcey tried to say that he was saying assisted suicide was a sin, and he was saying, I'm not speaking in terms of religion, or I'm not using religious language. I'm talking about human rights. And he was talking about, the fact that no man is an island, that what you do has an effect on other people, and legalizing assisted suicide has an effect on other vulnerable people. But like, her behavior was really extraordinary. I know Maria Main's writing on Grit said, like, it was an attempt to humiliate and disrespect an expert who had been invited into the chamber to share his considerable expertise. And she pointed out that he was like unfailingly polite, and that the senator, according to Maria Mains, said she acted like a spoiled, bratish child throwing her toys out of the pram. But the real point, I think, Arthur, is that Senator Ruane felt that she could behave like this. Like, there were rules in the Senate and in all the houses of the Oireachtas, and in regard to the behaviour of senators and TDs, and in particular how they behave in relation to guests. But even if those rules weren't in place, I think anyone looking at the video kind of sees this like snarling aggression towards somebody who has an opposing view to you on assisted suicide was absolutely out of order, especially from a senator. But I think it spoke to the bigger picture, that people who are pushing this are very aggressive. They're not interested in discussing the facts or the ethics of the matter. They're just trying to shout people down, and they're trying to shout people down so that they can have assisted suicide legalised in Ireland. And I think, we shouldn't let that happen.
It's quite interesting times we live in. It's quite a very interesting discussion. Time will tell what will come of that hearing in the Oireachtas. I want to move on, if I can. I want to speak about quite an interesting issue of conscientious objection for those working in the healthcare sector in Ireland. It has come in the news recently, of course, about the HSE and hiring people to work in the healthcare sector. Speak to us about that regard in terms of conscientious objection.
Yeah, so people might remember that when the abortion review was submitted, Mary O'Shea then appeared in front of the Health Committee. All these committees and the Oireachtas, but it is where a lot of the discussions take place now. And Mario Shea is a barrister who chairs the abortion review. And the review was very widely criticised by Life Institute and by other pro-life groups and organisations, because we were saying that it did not focus on any negative outcomes from the abortion law. Like, for example, it didn't seem to pass any heed to the rocketing abortion rates. It didn't look at baby Christopher case. It didn't, as Paddy Trubeen pointed out when he questioned Mario Shea, it didn't speak to one woman who had changed her mind during the 3-day wait before proceeding with an abortion. But then it still recommended that the 3-day wait be scrapped. So, you know, we were very, very unhappy with the abortion review, felt that it didn't actually do what it was meant to do, which was look at the outcomes of the abortion law, and look at the negative outcomes and really address those in a meaningful way. But when Mario Shea was in before the Oireachtas Committee, one of the points she raised was in relation to conscientious objection. And the review looked at this, and it looked at the fact that, you know, almost 90% of GPs don't provide abortion, and that when the review, at the time the report from the review was being written, 9 out of 19 maternity units don't provide abortion. And this, Mario Shea was saying, and other campaigners were saying, was unacceptable. And they were saying, in short, like to sum it up, that doctors could be discriminated against in the hiring process. So when the Department of Health or the HSE were hiring doctors, they could discriminate against them if those doctors said that they would seek to exercise their right to conscientiously object to the abortion process. And, you know, she was challenged on this by Michael McNamara TD, an independent TD from Clare. And he used this word discriminating, and he was saying, you know, do you accept then that would mean it would lessen the chance of someone with conscientious objection being recruited into the Irish Health Service? And Mario Shea said, yes, I would imagine so. And he asked her quizzically, like, do you think that's acceptable? And she said that it was. And I thought it was a great question by Michael McNamara, because he kind of pulled this out of the abortion review, and certainly I think managed to. He put Mario Shea into a position where she had to clarify what she meant. And what she is saying, and what others are arguing for, abortion campaigners certainly are, that, for example, if you wanted to hire an obstetrician for a hospital where abortions are not currently being carried out, that it would be a condition of that role, of the job spec, if you like, of that role, that person would carry out abortions. So that then, even if that was only a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of what the job entailed in general. So that if a doctor then in the interview said that he or she, you know, had sought to have conscientious objection, or that they wanted to establish their freedom of conscience in relation to abortion, they would not be hired. And of course, that would be like an extraordinary form of discrimination. So addressing this issue, Dr. Brendan Crowley wrote in the Medical Times, and then that was followed up by a statement for Doctors for Life, for Dr. Roland Cleary, and those other pro-life doctors in Doctors for Life, and supported by people like Nurses and Midwives for Life, who have very considerable membership across all of these groups. And they were saying like that this goes down to freedom of conscience, and that freedom of conscience is so incredibly important in medicine, and that in fact the abortion review should be looking to recognize and strengthen the right that every doctor should have to exercise their freedom of conscience. And Dr. Crowley was saying that, you know, many healthcare workers and doctors are of the opinion that abortion is the deliberate ending of human life. And of course, Arthur, that's like the facts tell us that, biology tells us that. And he points out that it would be abhorrent, use that word, to compel them to perform an abortion against their will. And he said it would violate the Hippocratic character of medicine as providing a social good. And he said it would have this downstream negative impact on social cohesion and trust, because doctors have to be able to trust the health service just as the health service and the patients trust them. And they have to be able to trust that when they go to work every day, they can uphold their right to conscience and their freedom of conscience. And, you know, he said, I thought it was an excellent article in that he challenged the Minister for Health on this. You know, he challenged them, saying that you cannot act or you should not act to erode freedom of conscience. In fact, we should be looking to recognise and strengthen it. And Doctors for Life similarly pointed out that, you know, this would be an unprecedented step if the government or the Department of Health or the HSE persisted with this and kind of this discrimination against doctors or any healthcare professionals who don't want to carry out abortions, and that the matter might end up in court, because to compel, as Dr. Ronan clearly said, to compel anyone to act against their conscience is draconian. And he also pointed out that at a time, we all know, Arthur, that the health service is really in crisis. You know, these ridiculous 1 million people on waiting lists, children with scoliosis can't seem to get their operations, people, cancers and other conditions going undiagnosed. So you have almost this chaos in the health service, yet the Minister for Health and the Department of Health seem to be trying to focus on bullying pro-life doctors or bullying pro-life healthcare professionals or nurses and midwives. And Ronan clearly was saying, like, at a time, and Trevor Hayes made this point to the Rally for Life this year too, at a time when the country is finding it so difficult to get suitably qualified doctors. We all know there's the amount of consultants' posts that are empty, like that the department should be mindful of attempting to compel doctors to act against their conscience, whether in regard to abortion or euthanasia, he said. And he said that if the HSE or the department started to openly discriminate against medics because of their moral stance on abortion, then he believed it would dissuade people from working in the HSE and might lead to litigation, might lead to a court case. So I thought it was important, very great to see pro-life doctors standing up and making that compelling case and standing up and saying, we will not accept that an erosion of our freedom of conscience rights, and in fact the government should be strengthening them.
It's interesting, of course, as well. It's not easy to stand up in this day and age, particularly in the age of cancel culture and so forth. It's not easy to stand up and to say, no, I will not go down that road. But well done for those doctors that are doing so. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. Of course, as we were speaking about earlier on about the Oireachtas hearing at the moment, and indeed about this issue of conscience objection, we were made, of course, many promises in the run-up to the abortion referendum many years ago that would not be touched, there would be no pressure placed on doctors. But of course, promises changes and a lot of things changes within politics. Niamh Uí Bhriain from the Life Institute, once again, thank you so much for taking time to chat to us today.
Thank you, Arthur. Pleasure.